This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. And we have with us at WZRD Bill Ayers. He is a legendary activist in Chicago. However, Bill, you're active not only in Chicago, but wherever uh, democracy needs your help. But first of all, could you define democracy to us?
I'm not sure I can define it in a dictionary way, but every word that we're going to talk about, democracy, freedom, abolition, they are important terms. They are also layered terms, and they're also not subject to dictionary definition so much as subject to understanding in practice as dynamic, living concepts. So for me, democracy is more than the formal ability to vote, although that's often what we're told as Americans, that we live in a democracy because we have the right to vote. But if you interrogate that a little bit, even in the American context, you realize that the Electoral College takes away many of our votes. Those of us in Illinois, for example, like yourself and like me, our vote doesn't count as much as somebody from North Dakota or Montana because of the peculiar history of the Electoral College. Nevertheless, America likes to boast, we are a democracy, you have the right to vote. Voter suppression is very much part of our society. Money in politics drains democracy of any meaning. So for me, I joined Students for a Democratic Society when I was 19 years old. And my father said to me at the time, Students for a Democratic Society, we are a democratic society, which made me and my friends laugh because we think of this as a very anemic democracy, not a vital, robust, living democracy. And so we in Students for a Democratic Society and in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee developed the concept of participatory democracy. And what we meant by that is democracy as an active pursuit of freedom, not democracy as a formal right to vote with all of the restrictions built into the American experiment in the American history, but rather as something you had to live. So democracy was a living, activated, participatory affair, not a distant, anemic, formal affair.
But how are we able to exercise the freedom that you desire when we're entrenched in this democracy that is centered on a vote?
Well, I think that we have a lot of work ahead of us. And one thing we have to do, if you're interested in the restrictions on voting, I think it's hugely important that people get involved in efforts like eliminating the Electoral College or getting money out of electoral politics. I mean, it seems to me those are two active campaigns we could be involved in right now. We do have an election coming up, Trudy, and um, I'm as kind of anxious and horrified as everyone else. But I think it's very important that people exercise their right to vote, as anemic and as distanced and as alienated as it sometimes seems. But I still think that if you think about voting as something not only that people all over the world have died fighting for, but it's an essential part of democracy. It's not the only part, but it's an essential part. And therefore, we shouldn't let it go easily. We should fight for it.
Trying to get the money, the special interests money out of the democratic process, that is so difficult. What have you seen and found that could actually work?
Well, the truth is that Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision several years ago, said that a corporation is the equivalent of a human being, and therefore the corporation has free speech, and therefore the corporation can give any amount of money it wants to. That made what was already a distorted anti-democratic system even more anti-democratic. So what is to be done? Well, we can't just accept it for what it is. We have to say this is objectionable, and we want to build the kind of social movement that can overturn the idea that money in politics is the only way to go. But I want to say, Trudy, two things. One is I'm all for people who want to participate as activists in electoral reform. There's all kinds of reforms we need. Doing away with the electoral college, getting rid of money in politics, doing away with gerrymandering, which is manipulating voting districts and so on. We have to do away with those things. We have to also remember that Black people couldn't vote in this country until relatively recently, that women couldn't vote until 100 years ago. So we have to kind of remind ourselves that things can change and things do change, but they change because we build social movements from the bottom up. I've never known a significant change to happen that didn't mobilize lots and lots of people to demand a new way of thinking and then acting on behalf of whatever social issue we're considering. Change doesn't come from the top. It comes because of fire from below. So there's all kinds of electoral things that could happen. But I want to pivot and also say, for me, there's two things that you need in order to bring about social change. One, um, you need the mobilization of masses of people, of workers, community members, students. You need to mobilize the people. And that's what I call fire from below. And then you also need real politics, that is, normal politics. So if you think about it, the great Black freedom movement of the 1950s and 60s, we brought about real change, but it happened because of fire from below, not because the president suddenly had a good idea. It was something we mobilized for, organized for, built for, fought for. And then it was important that a politician be in office who could work the levers of power and make the changes needed. But it never would have happened if we relied on the wisdom of our leaders. We have to rely on the wisdom of the people.
That does take a lot of work, but it could be done. Could you give us some examples? You did historically the historical examples. What's happening now that is representative of the work that you envision of the fire from below? And also try not to mention my name. It's easier to edit that way so that
Okay, thank you. I think there are many, many examples of social movements that have made a difference. Many, many examples. Let's go back to the abolition of slavery, because that wasn't a foregone, obvious conclusion. Um, but what happened in the 1840s, 1830s, the 1820s? Well, people were agitating for abolition of slavery. Most importantly, the energy that created the crisis that led to abolition was enslaved workers themselves escaping from bondage. And that created a social crisis. The abolitionist movement continued to do the kinds of things that organizers always do. That is, they leafleted, they built their own newspapers, they built their own media outlets, they knocked on doors, they elected politicians, they even built an underground to help the escaping workers to get away. They did many things. But if you and I were sitting here in Chicago in 1845, and we recognize that slavery is entangled in every institution of our country, slavery is the wealth of the country. How can we imagine abolishing it? Well, those people had the ethical ambition and the political vision that said, we have to do it. We don't know what it'll look like, but we have to do it. And in 1845, if you and I were having this conversation, we wouldn't know that 20 years later, slavery would be gone. But it was. And I think it's worth remembering that Abraham Lincoln, sometimes known as the Great Liberator, Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address in 1860 was an address where he said, nobody's read it because it's not in the school books. He said to the slave owners, I have no legal right, and I have no interest in abolishing slavery where it exists. Your institution is safe in my hands. 4 years later, the second inaugural address, which is in everyone's textbook, that's the one where he says, for every drop of blood drawn by the sword, by the whip, we will draw a drop of blood by the sword. For every hour of unrequited labor, we will recompense that labor. I mean, it was the most radical speech imaginable. In 4 years, what happened? Well, the abolitionist movement didn't stand still. The abolitionist movement continued. Enslaved workers continued to escape. And then there was a great civil war. and that changed Lincoln. So we have to remember things like that. But if you want a more recent example, 20 years ago, 20 years ago this year, we abolished the death penalty in Illinois. Nobody thought it could have been done 25 years ago or 30 years ago. Nobody living 30 years ago would say, oh, Illinois will lead the nation in doing away with the death penalty. That was unthinkable. But it happened. Why did it happen? Same pattern as I described with the Civil War. That is, the people on death row organized themselves as a force. They called themselves the Death Row 10. They began agitating about why the death penalty, death by execution, was inhumane and why it was unnecessary. They organized their mothers, who became a group called the Mothers of the Death Row 10. That led to a mass movement. There were lawyers and students and journalists involved. But the important thing is that we built a movement against the death penalty, and our slightly right-wing, slightly corrupt governor cleared death row 20 years ago. Unthinkable until it happened. So we have to remember that things are possible, even at a time when they feel like dire and difficult and impossible. But just think about it. As difficult as your life is or my life is, as many obstacles as we see in front of us, imagine being on death row and thinking up the idea that we could end this death penalty. That takes real vision and real courage. And people have done it before, we can do it again.
It seems as if what you're saying is that we really have to get the special interest out of the equation. As long as the heart is pure and there is that vision of doing something that's really, really necessary, and there's no selfish motive behind it, then if there are enough people to work together to bring it about, it could happen.
Well, the way we get special interests out of politics is by building a movement to get special interests out of politics. In other words, it's not going to happen because here's another way of saying it. It is true that people make history, but we don't make history on the grounds that we ourselves choose. We make history on the grounds that are given to us. So special interest is given to us. That's part of the equation that we have to figure out that we're opposing. It's not like we can be given, and sometimes I think activists sometimes say, well, there was a better time to be an activist. There was a better time to be a revolutionary. Probably true, but that doesn't take us anywhere because this is our time. This is the only time we have. So we have to dig in, make a concrete analysis of the conditions before us, figure out where the levers of power are, and so on. Let me give you one more example as long as we're in this territory. So if you had told me 2 years ago that the large sections of the American people would finally come to their senses about the Middle East and about Israel-Palestine, I would have told you you're out of your mind. There's no way. It's so entrenched. It's so much the special interests have it tied down. They have all the money. They have all the political power. But look what happened in a year. Within months after the pre-announced genocide assault against Gaza and against the Palestinian people, people began to wake up. The narrative began to change. Why? Because the Palestinian community, the Students for Justice in Palestine, the Jewish Voice for Peace, the activists, the organizers began to make a real difference, and they never let up. And I think there's something very encouraging about that. I'll give you a quick example. There's a Palestinian restaurant on 55th Street called the Nile. It's a wonderful restaurant. We've gone there for decades. The old man who owns the restaurant was in the other night when we went in for dinner, and he sat down with us and we talked. And he, of course, expressed grief, sadness, anger at what's going on in his home country. But then he said to me, if you'd told me, several years ago that this many Americans would stand up for Palestinian rights, I would have thought you were crazy. But it happened, and I'm so encouraged by it. So he found a way to mix his sadness, his grief, his anger with his hopefulness, because the narrative is changing. And the narrative is changing because of the organizing and activism of people who have a sensible, important, analysis of what's going on. I think that proves to me that we can go further, that we can not only change the narrative, we can change policy. Not right away, not because we snap our fingers, but because we do the hard, gritty work of organizing on the ground.
So is this organizing affecting the levers of power? And what are the levers of power now?
Well, there are many levers of power, obviously, but I would say because we live in a society that is founded on slavery and genocide, and because we live in a society that is characterized as racial capitalism, the levers of power are the capitalist class and their servants, the political class. And so those are levers of power. But one of the things I think we do too much of in the progressive movement, we spend too much time looking at the sites of power we have no access to, the Pentagon, the White House, the Wall Street, um, the medieval auction block called the Congress. And we don't spend enough time looking at the levers of power we have absolute access to, and that is the classroom, the house of worship, the community, the workplace. Those places are powerful too. And if we mobilize our power, it can be a match, not only a match, it can overcome their power. If we think of power only in terms of money and military force, they will win every time. But if we think of power as also the power of the imagination, the power of the narrative, the power to change hearts and minds, the power to mobilize ourselves so that we are an irresistible force for change. And since I've participated in movements like that, I know they're possible. But it's important also to remember that the day before Rosa Parks sat in on the bus, no one said, oh, the modern civil rights movement is about to be born. The day after, every commentator said, oh, that was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable, but it did happen. And we can build the conditions to make history right here, right now, not simply by voting, not by wringing our hands, not by being cynical, but by getting out there and doing the hard work of metaphorically knocking on doors, talking to strangers, writing letters, building media, being smart, being engaged, and building a social movement. We just saw it happen in the last year. The movement for peace in Gaza, the movement for Palestinian rights is alive and active, not only in the United States, in Europe, and all over the third world.
When you say that the capitalist system is causing a lot of this uh, undemocratic practices, let's say, how do we address the capitalist system? We are living in it. We even if we are going to organizing needs money, and that money has to come from somewhere, such as people working and people donating and people offering up resources, such as even computers or an internet. How do we uh, address the capitalist system and also continue organizing?
Well, it's true that organizing takes resources and organizing takes energy, but it's not, as I say, if we match our money against Elon Musk's money, we're doomed. We can't think of it in strictly money terms. We have to think of it in terms of human terms. So I'm often involved in fundraisers for progressive causes, fundraisers for progressive candidates. And sometimes when I make a pitch to my friends or neighbors, I'll say, it's like we were just at a fundraiser last week for prison reform. Now we're at a fundraiser for peace. All we're really doing is passing the same $10 hand to hand, and it sometimes seems like that. But but we can't despair because we don't have the resources they have. The resource we have that they don't have is the resource of a humane humanitarian imagination, and we can build that into political power over time. How do I know that's true? Because of the last year, because of doing away with the death penalty, because we abolished slavery. But one way to think about it, borrowing from the great Chicago organizer and leader, Miriam Kaba, who said, don't try to sit down and think of the best way to do your work. Think rather of a million experiments. If each of us is engaged in something not the best thing, not the overall thing, but if we're each involved in something that is involved with mobilizing people to make fundamental change and lean toward a more just, humane, balanced, peaceful, socialist world, we will find our way. But we can't do it by sitting on our couch and theorizing about the model that will get us to the promised land. It's not like that. Rather, we have to work day by day, step by step. And if each of us is involved in something, my students would often say to me, I can't do everything. And my answer is always, can you do something? If you can do something, that's where we begin. And then sometimes students will say to me, I'm just one person. What can one person do? And my answer is get a second person. So find another person, then there are two people, then find two more, then there are four people, and do something. And then connect that something to other somethings. And so we see right now the environmental movement, for example, which is alive and growing and driven by very exciting organizers and activists and militant actors. That environmental movement also sees itself as part of the peace movement, which sees itself as part of the anti-racist movement. Now we're beginning to build a movement that will become irresistible if we continue and we continue to draw energy into it.
How did you start? You have all these, you have all this wisdom, but it had to start from somewhere. And did it start when you were a student in college? How did it start?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure I know for sure, but I know that I was raised in a family that had the values that many American families have, and that is, we want to be fair people, we want to be kind people, we want to be decent people. Now, my father was a major industrialist and a major capitalist, but still the values that they espoused and the values they tried to practice at home were be kind to one another, be decent to one another. And then I came of age in the 1950s and the 1960s, and I saw a world in flames. And so the question of kindness and just being a just and kind and decent person suddenly was up against the fact that we lived in a country riven by racial divide, and that race was not just it wasn't just that the races were separate, it's that race was an indicator of power and wealth and opportunity. So I got involved in the civil rights movement because it was a natural extension of wanting to be a kind person and a decent person. And the more I got involved, the more I learned. And so the first time I was arrested, for example, opposing the war in Vietnam, my goal was to end one war. I just wanted to end a war. But within a couple of years, I saw that it wasn't just one war, it was a system that made war inevitable. And I've never, in all my long life, I'm 80 years old, I've never been at a time in this country when we weren't at war. We're always at war. And so, how do you explain that? How do you explain that we think of ourselves as peaceful people, but we have the largest military ever invented on Earth. We're the only people who've dropped atomic bombs on civilians. We created terrorism, a genocidal war in Vietnam. Now we are supplying genocidaires everywhere. So how do we bring that contradiction? How do we understand it? And my understanding is that our rhetoric does not match our reality and that we have to go deeper. And so I started off wanting to end segregation and wanting to end a war. I evolved to thinking I wanted to end white supremacy as a system, and I wanted to end a system that made war inevitable. And I now want a revolution. I think we need to create a popular social upheaval to reclaim our lives and to reclaim our freedom from the imperialistic, colonial, genocidal capitalist class.
You're talking about the 1%, the 1%, right?
I think the 1% is a very good way of saying it. And one of the things that you know and I know is that before the Occupy movement, nobody had ever heard of any concept called the 1%. But the Occupy movement popularized this idea that there's a tiny fraction of people who sit on top of us, and the rest of us actually have no access to their money or their power. And they have a monopoly on violence and a monopoly on power, and we have to oppose them. So I think that's a very, very helpful kind of metaphor, the 1%, the 99%. Yes, I think the 99%, if we ever get mobilized, we can bring about fundamental changes and create a very different world.
How far along would you say that 99% is now toward mobilizing and creating the fundamental change?
Well, you know, it's interesting because I don't think it's a linear progression. I don't think we move step by step by step. I think actually things, let me take again the question of Rosa Parks and the modern civil rights movement. I mean, what people forget when they focus on Rosa Parks is there were decades, century of organizing. In fact, if you think of the Black freedom movement as being a movement that is centuries old, and the 1950s and 60s being one iteration of that centuries old movement, you realize that Rosa Parks' action and the action of Dr. Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was built on the organizing and activism that went on in the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, Black Reconstruction in the South. It goes back 100 years. So whatever the civil rights movement was, it had its antecedents going back 100 years easily, but hundreds of years. And it was also not a thing in itself. It was prelude to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is prelude to the next iteration of struggle toward freedom. So I don't think of these things as linear or progressive in that way or moving step by step. I think of them as gathering strength, and then suddenly an outburst will happen that if you're not paying attention, you wouldn't think was possible. But if you're paying attention, you know that social movements are always that way. This is why, incidentally, I object to being called a person of the 60s. First of all, because there was no such thing as the 60s. Nobody looked at their watch on March 31st, 1969 and said, oh my gosh, it's almost over. No, nobody thinks like that. We don't live by decades. Rather, the 60s is marketing and kind of it's kind of a myth making. But the reality is the 60s flowed out of the 50s, which flowed out of the 40s, and the 60s flowed into the 70s and 80s. And I'm a person of this generation, meaning, yes, I was active in the 50s and the 60s. I'm active now. So I don't want to say I was active in the 60s and now I'm nostalgic for a ship that already left the shore. I'm alive now, and I want to make change now. And I think that we should all embrace that idea that we can't be pigeonholed as of the 60s or of the 70s. The upheaval of the Black freedom movement in the 50s and 60s led to the peace movement, led to the women's movement, led to the queer movement, led to the transgendered movement. So we are all of a piece. We are all in the same family. And we should embrace that and look forward and get busy now, not look back and say, oh, woe is me, I wish I'd been alive then. Forget about it. It wasn't that great. I mean, it was great, but it was no greater than today. So let's get busy now.
You're quite a historian. What was in Rosa Parks' head, and what did she know that you know of when she refused to give up her seat?
Well, you know, it's important to know that Rosa Parks was not the first person in Birmingham to refuse to give up her seat. Not at all. In Birmingham, Alabama, there were many, many women who had sat in and refused to leave their seats, and it didn't spark this movement. So the great poet laureate of the United States, Rita Dove, wrote a book called On the Bus with Rosa Parks. And it was poems about all the women who'd sat in before Rosa Parks, because Rosa Parks was standing on somebody's shoulders also. But the other thing to know about Rosa Parks was she hated, we knew her towards the end of her life, and she hated the idea that she wouldn't get up because she was tired. She'd say, yes, I was tired. I was tired of discrimination. I was tired of racism. I wasn't just tired from working. I was tired of the whole damn system. You know, and I think that it's worth remembering that Rosa Parks went to the Highlander Folk School, which was a center of organizing in the South. The Highlander Folk School is where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was born. It was the southern branch of the CIO for a period. It was founded by Miles Horton. Rosa Parks was at the Highlander Folk School the year before she sat in on the bus. And there they discussed nonviolent tactics. They discussed tactics to try to challenge and expose the racist apartheid system in the South. And Rosa Parks was the head of the NAACP in Birmingham. So it wasn't like she was an innocent. It was just a tired working person who wouldn't get up. She was tired of racism, and she had a strategy and a tactic that she thought could move the movement forward. It happened. The other thing about Rosa Parks is that Emmett Till had been murdered 100 days before she sat in on that bus. A gruesome, violent murder that awakened the nation. And she was so sickened by it, so angry about it, that she said, I have to make a move. I have to do something. And she did what she did. But it so happened that a young preacher named Martin Luther King was in town. It so happened there was all kinds of organizing that had gone on before. And they innocently enough called for a boycott of the buses. It wasn't a revolutionary tactic. It was just, and the interesting thing to me is that many of the old lefties, the old leftist progressives who had been around in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, when they saw the sit-in movement, they didn't embrace it right away. They said, what does that have to do with socialism? Well, get off your butt and take a look around. Activism matters, and activism against injustice can open up people to all kinds of ideas. So Martin Luther King, to take one example, he was only an activist for 13 years. Think about it. 13 years an activist, and he changed so dramatically every year that he went from somebody who wanted to integrate public transportation in Birmingham to being the leader of, and the symbolic leader of, a mass movement that overturned centuries of oppression. Did it get to where we wanted to go? Did it get to the promised land? No. But Martin Luther King was not only an activist and an organizer and a public educator, he was also became a socialist and became a person who believed that in order to really change the world, we had to get rid of poverty, we had to get rid of war. And he was a great, great spokesperson for those movements.
Well, earlier you mentioned that everybody needs to do a little something, and all of those pieces will come together. And that seems to be what happened with Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. They were two of the million pieces.
That's right. I mean, that's right. I would say everyone can do something. And it's not that they will come together, it's that we have to make them come together. In other words, you do your piece, you stand up and protest your injustice, and then connect it to another injustice. So if we're building an anti-war movement, let's also note that the biggest consumer of fossil fuels in the world is the Pentagon. So there's a reason that we want to think of war and warming. And then we have to remember that genocide and wars of aggression can only happen when you dehumanize other people. You can't drop an atomic bomb on people who are just like you. You have to make them less than human. And so we have to note that war and warming and scapegoating and racism and white supremacy, they're of a piece. Let's make those connections. Let's build a movement.
What did your father think about your becoming an activist and in the 50s and 60s when you took a stand and started your work?
It's interesting because my parents, my father lived with us the last 3 years of his life, and he had full-blown Alzheimer's at that point. But my father, of course, he wasn't prepared to understand what was coming in the 60s and in the 50s. He wasn't prepared for it because he wasn't a political person. He was a businessman, he was a capitalist. And so he didn't know what was coming. But he had 5 children. All of them became radicals. And imagine how amazed he must have been. But he came to terms with it as time went on. I remember, initially he said to me after I'd been underground for 11 years, and we were talking one day, and he said, I never understood you kids. I never understood why you couldn't do things the conventional way. But I also note, and I even knew it at the time, that you seemed happier and more engaged and smarter than most people I know. So I support you. And by the end, he was saying things like, well, everybody was against that damn Vietnam War. Of course, he wasn't at the time, but it was easy to be against it, 40 years later. just like we're all against slavery now. But what would you have done in 1845? You know, in 1845, to be against slavery was to be against your parents, the Bible, the founders, the Constitution, the law. Okay, let's give ourselves credit. We would have been against it, but it was very hard to be against it. And so what are we seeing now that's just conventional, common sense, that we really ought to see as the injustice that it is? We have to challenge ourselves to look deeper.
When I met you, I saw that you have some tattoos on your arms. Did you have those tattoos to support the causes that you support?
Well, I got my first tattoo when I was in the Merchant Marines. I quit college and in 1964, and I joined the Merchant Marines. And I was a sailor, and so I got tattoos. But the tattoo I got a red star on my shoulder because I had just believed that I had become a communist. And so I got a red star. Now the red star has faded to pink, like communism itself. And 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 but then I kept going, and as I went along, I got more and more tattoos, and now I'm covered. But you know, they say different things. So my tattoo right here on my wrist says, "Every day another story, each life a universe." And I got that tattoo as part of opposing, trying to figure out how to oppose youth suicide. Our next door neighbor took his own life, and it moved us to get involved in trying to figure out what the issues were that were driving young people to such despair. And so I'd sometimes get tattoos that have meaning like that. This tattoo is a rose. When we were underground, my partner of 53 years, Bernadine Dorn, her underground name was Rose. So on her birthday, I got a rose tattooed on my arm. So, you know, stupid things, but tattoos are pretty mindless. So there you are. And this tattoo on my hand, we were helping a young Venezuelan artist get her artist visa, and she stayed with us for 6 months. And when she left, she on the kitchen table, she put this tattoo on my hand, and she designed it, and she put a similar design on Bernadine's hand. So we have these kind of matching hand tattoos. And this tattoo, I don't know if you know the name Malik Alim, but Malik Alim was my friend and comrade, one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter Chicago. And when he died in a boating accident, this was his symbol. So I tattooed it on my hand. Anyway, they all mean different things. I have John Brown tattooed on my back. John Brown was the great abolitionist who really started the Civil War by attacking Harper's Ferry, and he's one of my absolute heroes in history. As I often say, he's one of the few white people in American history I really like, and so I got him on my back. Anyway, enough with the tattoos.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. As we move ahead, what would your next steps be? For instance, for students and for members of the community, what would you advise them to act on in order to make their lives better and more enlightened?
You know, I feel like, you know, when I was young, I had many mentors who were older. Now that I'm old, my mentors are all young. And so I want to learn from the young. I don't have a lot of advice. I have one kind of thing worth sharing with you, but I really do think that I learned from the students. One of the great gifts to me in my life as being a lifelong teacher. I started teaching in 1965, and I'm still teaching. And I learn every year, I learn from my students, whether those students are at elite universities like the University of Chicago, whether they're in high school, whether they're in preschool, or whether they're in Stateville prison. I always learn from my students. Great blessing of being a teacher. But I do think it's worth noting that all that to be an activist or to be an organizer or even to be a moral person, there's a certain rhythm that one ought to follow. And it's a rhythm that's easy to say and hard to do. But if the rhythm is this, You have to open your eyes and pay attention. You can't be a moral person or a good organizer if you're not paying attention to the world. And since the world is always changing, dynamic, flowing, new contradictions arise at all times, you have to keep your eyes open again and again, not once, but every day. You have to open your eyes and pay attention. Second thing you have to do is be astonished. You can't take for granted you can't take injustice for granted. You can't get used to seeing homeless children in downtown Chicago. That should be astonishing to you. And when I say astonished, I mean both astonished at the unnecessary suffering we see all around us, but also astonished at the beauty and the possibility and the wonder of human beings and what we're capable of. So you should be astonished at the beauty, the ecstasy, the wonder, and astonished at the unnecessary suffering. The third step is you should act. You have to do something. You can't simply notice it and then go back to sleep. You have to open your eyes, pay attention, be astonished, act. And then the fourth thing you have to do is doubt. If you don't doubt, you become arrogant and self-centered and dogmatic. And so for me, the best, when you're assessing your action, whether it's an organizing campaign or a free Mumia campaign or an anti-war action, when you're assessing it, there's a pedagogical standard. And the standard is, did I learn and did I teach? If I learned and I taught, then the action was worth thinking about and maybe replicating or expanding on. If I didn't learn anything and I didn't teach anyone, and I only say to myself, I looked so great on the TV news with my, mask on and my Molotov cocktail. That's not a good standard. Nobody cares how you looked on TV. The standard is, are you teaching? Are you learning? And then you have to repeat that. So that's my only advice. Pay attention, be astonished, act, doubt, repeat. And the one thing I know for sure is that when you start to feel self-righteous, you're wrong. Even if you're right on the issue, the self-righteous part is wrong. So when you think you're better than others, when you think that your only job in the world is pointing your finger and shaking it at people, you're definitely in the wrong territory. So if we're learning, if we're teaching, if we're thinking and we're staying alive, then I think we can build those kind of movements that we need. But if we get self-righteous and stuck and dogmatic and sectarian, no, we can't move forward.
It seems as if you're talking about the connections. You have to keep the connection alive and connected.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole point of being an organizer or an activist is relationship building. But frankly, again, my life, I've been very lucky because that's also true of teaching. Whatever else teaching is, whether you're teaching in a school or a freedom school or a community center or a prison, teaching is always about relationship building. Listening, you know, the best pedagogical gesture, and this is true for organizers as well, is dialogue. And that means listening with the possibility of being changed by what you hear, but also speaking with the possibility of being heard. And it's that dialogue that's the dialectic I try to nourish in myself because I want to be learning all the time, but I also don't want to be shut up. I want to say what I think and then change what I think by listening to others.
I interviewed Russell, I forgot his last name, I'll look it up, but he mentioned that uh, the it's the war machine. People are let's see, it's it's I will just ask you about it then. You did mention that people want to with the special interest, they keep war going, genocide going in order to feed the war machine is they're one of the special interests, right? And then are there little steps to work to address that?
Well, I think that just as slavery was completely entangled in our society at a certain point, and no one could really imagine a world without it, the war industry is so entangled in our economy. And if you think of the amount of how big our military is, $1 trillion a year, and if you think of the industries that support that, and here we are sending billions and billions in military aid to Israel, but not just Israel, billions to Ukraine, billions to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's insane if you think about it. And you think about the amount of the resources, the energy, the the intellectual thinking that goes into producing death. And if you can imagine turning all those resources, all that intelligence, all that engineering skill, everything towards solving problems collectively, not just for us, but in the world, it's just outrageous that we allow it to go on. And I think that we are, in many ways, mesmerized and put to sleep by the fact that what's right before us, the status quo, the given world, it's hard for us to say, well, this is the reality before us, but it's not the world as it could be or should be. That's where we need to nourish our imaginations. And that's where the arts come in many ways. We need to think of what could be or should be, not just what is. And if you can imagine a world without slavery, which we all can now because it's easy, because we did it, and the thing I often think about the time of slavery, if you were alive in the time of slavery and just an ordinary person, you were complicit in a crime against humanity. You were complicit, you were benefiting or you were suffering, whatever, but you were part of it. And once slavery was done away with, being a normal person, you didn't have to be unethical to just be normal, right? But under slavery, just living your daily life was an offense to somebody. Same is true of the war machine. Once we get rid of the war machine, if we can mobilize ourselves, and frankly, we have allies we're not even aware of. All over the world, people are repelled by the American war machine. They're intimidated by it also. Some people benefit from it, but most people are actually horrified. Once we can mobilize and free up those resources, that intellectual energy, that humanity, to not make war and death, but to make peace and love, a new world will heave into view. We have to imagine that. We have to work toward that.
When we speak of slavery, when people were living in when slavery was happening, they could actually see the abjectness, the what was the horror sometimes of slavery if they looked, and it wasn't that hard to find. For the war machine, it is harder for people to actually see what is going on. They might see an occasional news report, or let's say an occasional interview such as we're having, that the war machine is causing all this and causing so much suffering in the world. What is concrete in their daily lives that they could actually sense as people during slavery times saw how the slaves were suffering? Right now, people don't really see how the war machine is negatively impacting us. They're just living their lives, going to work, going home, going to sleep, going to work.
I think that's very much a description of how things are now, but it was also true then. I mean, people. One of the ways that people are unable to open their eyes to wake up to the reality is that we're constantly bombarded with myths and lies and the mythologizing of the world. There's a lot of ways that it works. One is that the world as it is considered the world as it has to be. So we talk about, progress, or we talk about, and we feel like this is the only possible world, or this is the best possible world we can hope for. That mythology weakens us. And that's why I think we have to say what world could be, what is a world that could be or should be. But I think during slavery, most people didn't see it. Certainly people in the North didn't see it. People in the South saw it. But in many ways, they convinced themselves that it was the best of all worlds. That is, that I'm kind to my slaves. I'm decent. I don't whip people. Yeah, that guy down the road is kind of a jerk, but I get along. And frankly, you could go generation after generation after generation without anybody raising a hand. And yet the system itself was violent to the core. It was upheld by violence. Nobody stayed there, even in Thomas Jefferson's wonderful Monticello. Nobody stayed there by choice. They stayed there because they had to, And I think that, there's all kinds of indications that people knew, but also people were mystified and people were made stupid. And that's part of the function of propaganda. It's part of the function of the American myth. So we often say about every politician who runs for office talks about their humble beginning, and only in America could this be possible. And it's all a pack of lies, and it's all meant to make us feel like, well, if I am not CEO of General Motors, or if I am not a senator or president of the United States, somehow it's on me. I failed. And then we have things, if we could go deeper into this, we have things like standardized tests, which make people not only think that there's an accurate measure of where they belong on the hierarchy of success and failure, but they own their own failure. So you don't do well. Well, you should have done better. You should have worked harder. You should have been smarter. All of that is myth making at the highest level. We don't need to buy it, but too often we do. And I think part of our job as progressives, as radicals, as revolutionaries is to change the narrative, is to explode the myths. So we should explode the myth of standardized testing. We should explode the myth of the meritocracy. And we should fight against those things. That's part of our work. But a large part of our work is being arm in arm, heart to heart with our community, the people we work with, the people we live with, and imagine and demand something much better than what we have, something more peaceful, more cooperative, more balanced than what we have. We should object to the war makers. We should object to the fact that we have $1 trillion more war budget every year. We should object to the fact that we're at war everywhere. We should object to the fact that the administration in power and the one that whatever administration comes next all the time keep repeating the same stupid cliches about Israel has a right to defend itself, as if that justifies genocide. There was a fighter hidden in that building, as if that justifies bombing an apartment building and killing 50 or 100 people. I remember, this is so familiar to me because I remember in Vietnam, every time a village was destroyed by the United States, it's because there was a communist in there. But that's somehow supposed to justify the murder of, 75 kids and 40 elderly people and so on. We were able to expose that by building a social movement. We can do it again. That is, we have to humanize the so-called enemy. In Vietnam, one of the most effective things that we did is we had a publication called Faces of Vietnam. And if you saw these people as human, somebody with a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a cousin, a friend, a lover, then you saw they were different. They weren't a different species. They were like us. And if they're like us, it's hard to just murder them wholesale. And I think we have to do the same thing. And we are doing the same thing in Palestine.
Faces of Vietnam, who published that?
It was published by I think it was a Movement Press. I think it might have been called The Movement Press. I am sure it's available in some archive at the University of Wisconsin. But it was a marvelous thing because, and you're not old enough to remember this, but there were pictures. I mean, the American media, which is deeply dishonest, the commercial media, but when young reporters went to Vietnam in 1965, 66, 67, and they saw the truth of what was going on, and when young GIs came back and told the truth about what they were forced to do, what they were expected to do, what they suffered, people began to change. And that was hugely important. I think it's worth noting that since Vietnam, the Pentagon issued a report in 1975 that said no American journalist should have free access to an American battlefield ever again. And they never have. So it's worth noting that in Gaza, not only has Al Jazeera been, the offices in the West Bank closed and so on, but over 100 journalists have been murdered, many of them targeted by snipers. So there's a reason they don't want you to know. And that's all the more reason that we should fight to know, to interrogate the world, and to learn for ourselves what's going on.
You spoke about allies that that we have as well against the war machine in other countries. Who are those allies?
Allies in terms of, say more.
Against the war machine. You said that do have allies against the.
Oh yeah. I would say, well, look, during the Vietnam War, just to take another example, and then I'll tell you more about today. But during the Vietnam War, from 1965, when I was first arrested opposing the war, to 1968, after I'd been arrested many times and did a lot of organizing, a lot of activism, um, the United States population went from 20% against the war to 55% against the war in 3 years. It takes Americans about that long to catch up. But in terms of the world, by 1968, I would say 90% of the world was against the American war in Vietnam. You know, huge masses of people all over Asia, Africa, Latin America. And in many ways, the burden of the war for the US ruling class and war makers, the burden of the war was isolation in the world. That was part of the burden. Today, there's a very similar thing. Israel could not go on with its genocide for a week if the United States stopped supporting them. Why? Because no one else supports them. The United States vetoed, they vetoed resolutions in the United Nations for decades, protecting their their ally, their protectorate, Israel. But they just vetoed a resolution that would have allowed aid to get into the Palestinian people. I mean, this is a monstrous relationship. And so we are isolated in the world. Who are our allies? Our allies are all over Europe, all over Africa, all over Asia, all over Latin America. Masses of people recognize what Israel is doing as a genocide. It was pre-announced. They said, we're going to destroy Gaza and make it unlivable. We're not going to allow food or medicine or fuel. They said it in October 10th, 11th, 12th. The government said that's what they were going to do, and they are doing it. And the United States, all that the administration can kind of feebly mutter is, well, we're urging them to be restrained. That's inadequate. That's outrageous. That's immoral. That's criminal. And and here Israel does a terrorist attack in Beirut where they have pagers blowing up in people's homes. That's terrorism. That's against international law. And the United States says, wow, it was a surprise attack. That's our criminal government. We have to rise up and oppose that. And who are our allies? Everyone else in the world. You know, there's not a single country that would stand by Israel except that the United States is doing it.
What is the U.S. getting back from Israel since they are helping Israel in this way?
They're getting back a lot of things. And you know, one thing that they're getting is a cat's paw in the Middle East. That is an outpost of their own imperial ambitions. The thing that's astonishing about Israel, really, is that it's a 19th century kind of settler colonialism. It's not a 20th century or 21st century neo-imperialism, which is what we engage in with other countries all the time. We manipulate governments, we penetrate countries uh, economically. But what you see in Israel is very much like Australia 200 years ago, like the United States 200 years ago. It's a settler colonial country. And that is, they send people in, they ethnically cleanse or destroy or genocide the population, the native population, and they take over. If you look closely at what's happening in the West Bank, that could have been Oklahoma 120 years ago. People move in, they set up camp, they drive the natives out, and if the natives object, the US military comes in and kills people. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the West Bank.
So the United States cannot get any other outposts in the Middle East except for Israel then.
Well, actually, they have other outposts. They have puppet governments and so on. But Israel is the major kind of the major outpost for them in the Middle East, and it's got diminishing returns. I mean, when you ask what do they get out of it, frankly, it's a contradiction. They've gotten a lot out of it. The political class is very worried about losing any Zionist support that they get for their political party, and that's stupid because it's a short-term view. And I think one of the things that we're fighting about right now in this country is whether anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are the same thing, which they are clearly not the same thing. Zionism is a relatively recent invention, and it's quite different than what, you know, um, Jewish tradition has been about for thousands of years. So I think that we can't be cowed by this idea that somehow if you build an encampment, you're anti-Semitic. It's an interesting parallel that reminds me of the fact that, when we were wearing T-shirts that said Black Lives Matter, occasionally we'd run into a reactionary who would say, but white lives matter too. And of course that's true, but that's assumed. Like if I were wearing a T-shirt in Germany in 1935 that said Jewish lives matter, and you came up to me and said, but German lives matter too. Of course, that's true, but it misses the point. The lives that are being destroyed are Jewish lives or Black lives, or in this period, in this context we're talking about, Palestinian lives. So when I stand up and say Palestinian lives matter, Palestine should have the right to self-determination, I'm not saying anything that's anti-Semitic. I'm saying something that's humane and human about who's the target of genocide and extermination right now in our world, with our government supporting it wholeheartedly.
Since the U.S. uses Israel to as an outpost and sends so much money to Israel, how much money are they getting in return? Is there any transparency as to how that money is being used, whatever money that the U.S. sends to Israel?
I don't really know the answer to that. I know that there are things that we should all be reading. There's a current article in Mother Jones, an interview with Rashid Khalidi, the great Palestinian scholar. Everyone should read Rashid Khalidi's book, 100 Years War Against Palestine. Everyone should read Nathan Thrall's book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salam. These are books that really will educate you. And this is a teachable moment. Our government is up to its arms in blood, and our government is supplying one of the most brutal genocides we've ever witnessed. And even though we don't have journalists on the ground, we can see it because of social media, and we can know it if we pay attention. And we should pay attention, and we should use this as a moment to learn. One of the things I loved about the encampments was that they were really sites of learning. There were libraries, there were food stations, there were mutual aid stations. It was a utopian community. Every encampment I visited, Columbia, NYU, Northwestern, UIC, U Chicago, these were utopian communities. And instead of embracing them and saying, here's a moment when we're really learning about a moral issue of our time, the universities repressed them and brought the police, which is really a damning spot on university administrators today. But yeah, I think we should teach ourselves what's going on. I don't know enough. You don't know enough. None of us knows enough. We should study. We should be engaged. We should be thinking and talking.
I think what I was asking earlier about what Russell Norman said. He said that neither side would want to give up the war, neither Palestine nor Israel, because it helps both sides to keep the war going. What do you think about that?
No, I don't think so. I think that Palestine is being decimated and has been. I think that we're in the United States, we're not in a position to dictate to the oppressed people how they should respond. I think that, you know, when the South Africans were fighting against apartheid, there were some American Marxists who wanted to tell us what was the best group, what was the less best group. It's not up to us. That's up to the South African people. And similarly, the Gazans have been living for decades in an open air prison. The Palestinian people have been living since 1948 in what is an extended catastrophe. That is, ethnic cleansing has gone on from the beginning. The state of Israel wouldn't exist without ethnic cleansing and seizing of land and driving out of Palestinians. So here we have an ethnic state, an apartheid state, and we as Americans should say we support the right of people to self-determination. And that means everyone. The Israeli government passed a law a couple of years ago. It's their state law, and it says only the Jewish people have the right to self-determination. That's racism. That's ethno-racism from the beginning, and we should oppose it. The Palestinian people are also human, 100% human, just like you, just like me, just like any Israeli, but they are second-class citizens on their own land. That we should object to.
When we talk about the U.S. Supporting Israel, and then Israel really not giving that much back to the U.S., is it that some of that money and some of that support that is going to Israel is ending up actually in the special interest? Do you know anything about that?
I don't. I know the war machine profits, but I think, this is one of the everything isn't rational. So the American government poured billions of dollars into suppressing and defeating communism in Vietnam, and they lost. What were they getting from it? God knows, it wasn't transactional in that sense. They were there for a larger ideological purpose. I think that they not only lost prestige in the world in many ways, 1968, Vietnam defeating the United States, turned the tide around U.S. empire. And now it's in a different phase and there are different things going on. But I think we can't do a straight calculation and say, well, this is what the U.S. gets from Israel. It's part of an ideological project of saying, you have every right to be an ethno state, to be an apartheid state, and we will support you to the end. You and I are responsible to end that relationship, and I think we can. Listen, I'm going to have to go soon. I'm
Okay,
sorry to say.
okay, yeah, it's so wonderful having you with us. Could I ask one more question?
Of course.
Okay. You mentioned earlier about Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural speech. Since it wasn't in the history books, where did you find it, and how could we also access these texts and these documents that are not in our history books?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important is that you can get it online. You can get everything online. So text Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, and it'll pop right up. When I say it's not in the textbooks, there's a very good reason that we tell a story about ourselves that's largely mythologized. And yet, what's wonderful about being alive right here, right now, is that historians and both professional historians and lay historians and students and kids are finding their own way. And we should remind ourselves and we should remind our students, you need no one's permission to interrogate the world. That's why Ta-Nehisi Coates, the great African-American essayist and writer, says in his first memoir, he says, I was made for the library, not the classroom. Meaning, I don't want to follow your curriculum. I want to read everything. I want access to everything. And we should all take that as a kind of personal challenge. I want to read everything. I don't want your reading list. I don't want my teacher's reading list or my parents' reading list. I want to read everything, follow this to this to this. But I know that I need to know more in order to do more. And therefore, I'm always wanting to be learning, always wanting to be reading. And a very simple thing we can all do is organize a small reading group, a group that takes up a book. Like, for example, at the encampments, I watched students organize reading groups on Israel Palestine. That was so exciting because they realized that they were ignorant of something that was happening right in front of them in their names. So let's interrogate the world, and let's not wait for somebody to tell us what's in the curriculum. Let's make the curriculum the whole wide world.
Bill Ayers, if our listeners want to learn more about you, where should they go?
First of all, I have a new book out called When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer. The subtitle is Reflections on Collective Freedom. So I hope folks will pick that up. But I also wrote two memoirs. One is called Fugitive Days, a memoir, and one is called Public Enemy. And those are two memoirs, one about our years underground and one about more recent years. But I have a podcast called Under the Tree, a seminar on freedom. I would love it if people would check out that. And then the other podcast I have to recommend is my son Zaid Dorn did a podcast called Mother Country Radicals. And that is really a brilliant history of an aspect of the 60s that is often not in the textbooks. So Mother Country Radicals, Under the Tree, and When Freedom is the Question, Abolition is the Answer.
Thank you, Bill. And if you can, please send us all of that and we'll include it in the description with this interview.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill Ayers, for joining us on WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM.
Thank you so much. Now I can say Trudy.
Yes.
Thanks, Trudy. Okay, we'll talk again soon, I hope.
I hope so too. Thank you.
And did you have a good time with Rachel DeWaskin?
Yes, I'm trying to get the link, and then once I have it, I'll send it to you and to Rachel.
Please do. Please do. Okay, thanks, Trudy. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.